after this?
in a different room. Yeah, I canceled.
I know. I checked first thing when I came in. I said, is he coming? They're like, no. How could he really? He just... Well, we'll be on C-SPAN anyway.
What's that?
We're on C-SPAN
Oh,
anyway. I think so. I think they told me they're covering this. So don't act like there's a small audience. Act like there's a big audience.
So it's your program on Sinclair daily program?
It's Sundays.
Some
Weekly.
just
Yeah.
wasn't.
It's hard for me to even get that much done once a week. We're a really small staff, and they would like me to do a daily program, but I just can't imagine. I don't want to be. I'm not a pundit. Like, I'm not a comment on anything
Right.
kind of person.
Can you actually do recording?
Yeah, I try. I get asked all the time. They'll go, can you be on the radio show or Fox or whatever? And I'll go, what's the topic? They go, well, whatever. It's news of the day. I'm like, no, because I don't know anything about. I only know about what I studied, and I'm not a political analyst or anything like that. Cannot analyze politics.
Nonstop.
I see these. Yeah. You all have water? Okay. It's very cold in here. It is chilly.
Okay, everybody. Hi, how are you? Thanks for being at the Miami-Dade Book Fair. My name is Merle Wexler, and I'm a volunteer/instructor at several of the campuses, and I want to welcome you here. I am not going to go into the awards and accolades, of which there's a lot. So I'd rather save the time for the authors to speak, if that's okay with you. Is that okay with you? Okay. Okay, good. Also afterwards, I believe there's a book signing downstairs. So when they're done, somebody will take them, the authors, and you downstairs. And without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to both of our authors. I don't know who's going to go first. Is it Ken? Okay. Ken's going to, huh?
I drew the short straw.
You drew the short straw. Anyhow, he drew the straw. And thank you so much again for being here. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So I think what Cheryl and I are going to do, we're each going to read some selections from our latest books, and then open it up for questions, which is personally what I would rather do for the whole session, but we'll give you a little bit of a taste of the book, of my book, and Cheryl will do the same for hers. So my book, Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. And all books have some type of creation story, and mine starts on my home street of Hobart Street in Mount Pleasant, a part of Washington, D.C., where I live. And the story I'm about to tell doesn't necessarily paint my street in the kindest light. It's lovely, though. But it's a slice of America which I think is being replicated more and more across the country. So Mount Pleasant, nice neighborhood, very diverse, and that's where I'll sort of pick up the book early on. So our commitment to diversity is pretty complete when it comes to black, white, and brown, and to the rainbow colors of the gay pride flag. But it falls a little short when it comes to red and blue. The neighborhood is astonishingly Democratic and liberal. Hillary Clinton received 92.5% of the vote in the 2016 general election, and Jill Stein outpolled Donald Trump in my precinct by a narrow margin. During 2016, it was always very easy to spot a Bernie Sanders or a Black Lives Matter yard sign, but good luck finding one for Bush or Kasich, let alone Trump or Cruz. In the past, I never paid much attention to the political homogeneity of Hobart Street, other than a joke here or there with my neighbors. Hobart Street and the Mount Pleasant neighborhood, after all, aren't that different from the wider city, and let's face it, I fit in rather well, being a lifelong Democrat married to a Democratic staffer on Capitol Hill. It all seemed pretty natural until Porch Fest. Say what you want about Hobart Street, but it has a lot of team spirit. Every Halloween, the street is closed to traffic, and kids from miles around come here, certainly attracted by the efficient access to candy provided by row homes, and perhaps by the dead baby house, a neighbor who strings baby dolls in various bloody poses and then drops them down on the trick-or-treaters as they approach the front porch. I said we have team spirit, not good taste. Porch Fest is the other main festival of the Hobart social calendar, our annual block party held each June. Virtually every house in the block contributes something: a food stand, music, home-brewed beer, a slip inside for the kids. My wife, Beth, stays up all night baking cookies, which she cuts variously into the shape of the Washington Monument, the Capitol Building, and a map of the District of Columbia. Some she decorates herself, but others are left unfrosted so the kids can wield the icing tubes like Junior Jackson Pollocks. They do that with uncommon enthusiasm, if not complete coordination. For days afterwards, our front step looks like the victim of a food coloring balloon prank. The highlight of Porch Fest is the annual parade, which is always led by a marching band, a fire truck from the local firehouse, the same vintage convertible that appears at each Porch Fest and then is not seen again on Hobart Street for the rest of the year, and all the kids on the block, some riding bikes or scooters, others tunelessly playing musical instruments, or in the case of my 9-year-old son, Nate, now 10, randomly throwing a baseball up in the air. It's all hopelessly chaotic, like a band in which all the musicians are playing from different sheet music, and it's all wonderful. And every year the parade starts with the children reciting the Hobart Street Pledge. I always love the pledge, at least the concept of it, that in our increasingly entropic world, we share a community, an identity, a home here on Hobart Street. I love the pledge, that is, until I bother to listen to the words, which I discovered one year go something like this. I pledge allegiance to Hobart Street Northwest, gay or straight, woman or man, all are welcome on Hobart Street, except for Republicans. The end of the pledge was meant to be all in good fun, I suppose, except that it reflects an uncomfortable truth. As much of my neighbors on Hobart Street speak to the values of diversity and tolerance, they have no real interest in viewpoint diversity. I have tried episodically and unsystematically to find a Republican on Hobart Street. They must be there. Our precinct is 94% Democratic, an astonishing number on its face, but that must mean that there's still 6% somewhere. It's simple to find Democrats. Bernie banners, yes. Hillary bumper stickers, sure. Black Lives Matter yard signs, plenty of them. And everybody sucks, we're screwed 2016 sign that pops up right after the election, you bet. But evidence of support for Bush, Kasich, Cruz, Carson, or Trump, no, 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 and hell no. So that's the story of the beginning of this book. And it makes Hobart Street sound a little bit narrow-minded, but in truth, it is happening across the country. It's a little bit called the Big Sort. We're sorting ourselves into different neighborhoods, red neighborhoods, blue neighborhoods. The Washington Post did a poll during the last election in Virginia, a purple state, evenly divided. And they asked Trump supporters, do you have any close personal friends or family members who are going for Hillary? And they asked the same of Clinton supporters. Do you have any close personal friends or family members voting for Trump? And think about it. I mean, think how many people fall in that category in an evenly divided state. And about 60% of people on both sides of the aisle said they didn't know anyone voting for the other side. And when you don't know people on their side, it becomes really easy to demonize them. And that's really what's happened in this country. So for me, the Hobart Street Pledge was a starter's pistol on saying, you know, if I'm going to really talk about these issues, I need to see things from the other side. It's actually a quote from Atticus Finch that starts this off. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, from To Kill a Mockingbird. And that's the book is about. My year leaving my 94% Democratic district, 100% Democratic household, and spending the year with Republicans. That means think tanks and hunts and churches and all the things, bars in Youngstown, Ohio, little mining communities in Pikeville, Kentucky, and really trying to understand things from the other side. And that's what the book's about. I want to read you just two quick selections from it. So one of the things early on, I read a quote in the Washington Post. Actually changed my media mix. I mean, I've spent my career at places like NPR, but I said if I'm going to see things from the other point of view, I started watching Fox a lot and reading Breitbart and all sorts of things. But I still read the Washington Post, and I saw a quote from the guy who runs Heritage Action, who said, you know, the people in the Acela corridor, apparently that's me, that's you too, they don't know the awesomeness of America. I said, I got to do that. I got to find the awesomeness of America. And where do you go? So I called up Tucker Carlson, who I knew slightly, and went to see Tucker and said, Tucker, I need to find the awesomeness of America. Where do I go? It's kind of a strange question, but literally that's what I said. And he sort of paused for about half a second, so it was about as long as Tucker Carlson will ever pause. And he says, go pig hunting in Texas. And I did. So I flew to Houston, drove out to Gonzales, Texas, confessed to the guy who ran the place that I'd never shot a gun before. And he was a little bit perturbed by that. And he thought I was a danger to myself and others, which is probably true. And he sent me off by myself, which makes for, he said, the pigs will come to me. They did not. So I wandered off, and this is a selection I'll pick up, wandered off looking for people to hunt with. Fortunately, no one mistakes me for the world's only upright day-glow pig, and I soon make new friends. Turns out once you're liberated from hunting purgatory, Independence Ranch is quite a lovely place for a stroll. The trees are high and thick, a peaceful silence hangs over the place, and except for the occasional and distant sound of gunfire, it is all terribly tranquil. Spread to my right is CJ, and to my left is his 8-year-old son, Isaac. Somewhere out further in the woods is CJ's father, who was later introduced to me only as Paps. The three of them had driven 14 hours from their home in Georgia 2 days before, and will be making the long drive home tonight. We've been walking the woods for at least an hour, and it's had all the drama of a walk from my office to the local sandwich shop, except that trip holds out the promise of some food at the other end. We've seen a few troops of pigs in the distance running fast and always the wrong way, but not nearly close enough even to contemplate a shot. It doesn't bother CJ or Isaac since the day before, in young Isaac's evocative words, they had already shot the shit out of a bunch of pigs. But I'm antsy, concerned that I will go through my day without any real action. After a while, CJ goes off to find Paps, leaving me to stalk pigs alone with Isaac. You might think it is a risk, leaving your young son with an armed stranger, but it seems natural amid the comfortable camaraderie of the hunt. In truth, it is Isaac who quickly establishes leadership in our two-man band. When I keep forgetting basic rules of gun safety, like swinging the gun in his direction every time I turn to talk to him, it is little Isaac who gently reminds me to keep the gun pointed toward the ground at all times. Fortunately, he takes a bit of a shine to me, perhaps because he perceives me as just another kid, albeit a rather large, bald, and apparently dim-witted one who has trouble grasping the simplest rules of hunting. We walk together for the balance of the morning, never getting close enough to the pigs to take a shot, but sharing hunting stories as men do. Although we're short a man, I have no hunting stories to tell. Isaac does have some nice stories about his hunting trips with his father and grandfather, although they all devolve at some point into shooting the shit out of things. To see a kid like Isaac handle himself in this way is remarkable to see. I love my son Nate. He is a whiz at math and a walking encyclopedia of baseball history, but I wouldn't trust the kid with a particularly pointy stick, let alone a loaded rifle. Everyone I met at the Independence Ranch learned to shoot at 5. And Isaac has guns hanging over his bed at home in Georgia. The reason I ultimately went, other than Tucker's advice, went pig hunting is because I wanted to challenge myself on an issue which I thought I had to be right on gun control versus gun rights. Going to Gonzales, Texas, just a slice of my research, but it's sort of an evocative moment because Gonzales is about 8 miles as the crow flies from Sutherland Springs, Texas, where the last big church shooting took place about 3 weeks ago. It's 8 miles by crow, about 30 miles by road, and that's part of the story. And one of the things you see in things like Sutherland Springs is everyone takes different things away from that. Liberals take, holy cow, we need gun control. People running there around with AR-15s, there are 100 million of them in this country, shooting up a lot of places, and we need gun control. Conservatives look and say, wait a minute, it was an NRA instructor who pulled his own AR-15 and ultimately diffused the situation because there was no cop coming for 30 minutes. One of the bumper stickers you'll see at gun shows I saw was, I'd rather have a gun in my hand than a cop on the phone. And there's all sorts of, people take all sorts of different lessons from the same set of facts. That's part of the story here, was trying to see things from different points of view. And it was sort of an extraordinary experience. One last, am I running too late? Too long?
Sounds good to me.
All right.
I want to hear more.
All right. Get closer to the mic. Thank you. Any other instructions? I take instructions well. I want to tell you about just my trip a little bit to Pikeville, Kentucky. I want to give you a little bit of context to it. And I want to tell you a sort of a study by a company, no one's really talked about this, called Sentier Research. And it sort of sets up a trip into, really into the Trump base, the white working class, which is the group that really carried him to victory. In October 2016, spurred by the rise of Donald Trump, a firm called Sentier Research looked at the change in economic status for white men with college degrees compared to white men with only high school degrees. Change in fortune for those two groups over the study period from 1996 to 2014 was extraordinary. It was a good time to have a college degree. Incomes for college graduates in real terms rose 23%. Those with only a high school education, on the other hand, saw a reversal of fortune. Income expressed in 2014 dollars actually fell 9% over that period. It is a shocking number. At a time of broad economic expansion, a huge cross-section of the American workforce experienced a Depression-era effect on their income. Sentier did one other interesting thing. They ran what they called a cohort analysis, following the incomes of different age groups through the 18 years of the study. For example, the average 25-year-old white college graduate student in 1998 earned $40,000, $40,487 if you're counting. Over the next 18 years, as he acquired more experience and more expertise, and as he received promotions and seniorities, his income rose to $94,000, or by about 132%. It's a nice progression. It's perhaps what you would expect over the course of a solid career. But if you had only a high school education, it is an entirely different picture. Your income in 1996 would have been a step lower at $32,000. Again, that is roughly what you might expect, a solid and not overwhelming 20% differential from a similarly situated person with a college degree. But the real differences emerge only over time. Unlike the college composite, as a high school graduate acquired experience, knowledge, and wisdom, his earnings barely budged. By 2014, the typical high school grad would have been in his mid-40s and probably close to the top of his earning potential, and yet his income would only be $38,000. Think about it for a moment. In those 18 years, our newfound high school friend might have acquired a spouse and kids and car payments and perhaps a mortgage. He might have put in 2 decades of hard physical labor. His body might be breaking down, his health care needs might be rising up. He might be grappling with aging parents and other assorted responsibilities. And he would barely have more money than when he was 25 years old and relatively unencumbered. It is an enormously bleak picture, and if he'd known back in 1996 what he would be facing 18 years down the road, he might have given some serious thought to just ending it all. And that's exactly what more and more working class whites are doing. The white working class, which is sort of a little bit of an arc of the story, sort of on a 30-year losing streak. Mortality rates down, mortality rates up, income levels down, opioid addiction up, sense of opportunity, sense of the American dream way down. And that's really part of the story of the 2016 electorate. So let me just tell you about one fellow I met, and then I'll turn it over to Cheryl. A guy named Walter Dixon. So Walter, I'm going to sort of skip some of the preamble and just sort of tell you. Well, let me say, like many I met, Walter Dixon found his first job in the mines with the expectation that he had secured employment for life. And for a number of years, it all went rather well. He started as a scale house operator making $13 an hour, but was quickly elevated to running a coal washing operation making $20 an hour. Goes a long way in Pikeville, long enough that Dixon could make a good living and even bypass overtime in favor of spending more time with his wife and infant son. But in September 2013, his employer, the James River Coal Company, abruptly closed 4 Kentucky coal mines, and with hours, Dixon, along with more than 500 other miners and support personnel, was on the street. Along with a job and all sense of a semblance of economic certainty. It is one thing to lose a job, many of us have been disfavored with that experience, but another thing to lose a job when your local economy is in free fall. With the exception of a brief interlude when mining resumed, Dixon has been formally unemployed since, living off the underground economy. He has an electrician's skills, but not an electrician's license, so a local electrician has paid him cash under the table for occasional piecework. On the day I met him, he was on the way to interview for a salesman job with Transamerica Insurance. He smiled at me and said, hopefully it's the best shot I've had for a long time. Like everyone else I spoke to in Pikeville, Dixon views the federal government as an oppressive force, the instrument of the coal industry's downfall in Kentucky via clean coal regulations. The story is similar to Martinsville, where I went to the NASCAR races, in the sense that economic forces are perceived to be in the hands of distant corporations or indifferent government decision makers. None of the stories are as clean or as neat as the locals have you believe, but it's much easier to rally against a form of internal colonialism than it is against market forces and economic changes. For Dixon, the sense of grievance, of abandonment by those who are supposed to help them, has led him to Donald Trump, not out of any great affection. And I'll just parenthesis, this is a very typical experience I had during the year. Not out of any great affection, but out of the belief that he will either, quote, be a great leader or launch World War III. That comment is worth a pause because that is not a bet I would make on my own behalf or for the country, but when you're on your back in Pikeville looking up from the bottom of the pyramid, the perspective is quite a bit different. So I'm going to pause there, and hopefully we can pick up that conversation during the Q&A time.
Great job.
Okay, I'm Cheryl Atkinson. Can you hear me okay? And my book is called The Smear, as some of my friends like to call it, the schmear. How shady political operatives and fake news control what you see, what you think, and how you vote. So I think I'll just get right to my excerpts, which explain some of my thought process and what the book is about. Nearly every day, my overloaded email inbox is peppered with pleas from viewers asking, no, begging me to investigate tales of the implausible and unbelievable. They're convinced that the truth is being hidden from them on a massive scale, that someone is manipulating what they see on the news and online, conspiring to hide select facts and advance particular narratives, colluding on plots to smear certain people. Their suspicions are correct, even if their notion of the truth is often confused. In fact, the confusion is often by grand design. At the end of campaign 2016, one story they urged me to investigate is Pizzagate. It's a twisted conglomeration of unthinkable accusations about Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton and her inner circle. News of this shocking scandal has been circulating on the internet, and conspiracy theorists believe the mainstream press is covering it up. The allegations are whispered about and forwarded through social media, quasi-news sites, blogs, and videos posted by nameless sources. The stories are filled with names of real people and places, blended with fabricated tales of child rape, a porn ring, and a pizza parlor supposedly trafficking in underage sex through a basement tunnel. A mysterious video posted under the moniker Anonymous promises that the final week of the campaign will reveal irrefutable evidence of indictable crimes. The sources of this as yet unrevealed information, according to the video, have been contacted by the FBI, which is getting ready to sweep in and make arrests. I'm busy working on pressing stories for my weekly news program, Full Measure, at the time, but I poke around in case there's anything to any of it. I look at the websites, I check out the videos, I consult sources who might know if there are real law enforcement investigations underway. I quickly detect telltale signs of misinformation. Meanwhile, Donald Trump faces his own parade of false accusations, and I'm getting emails about those as well. Viewers want to know why I'm not reporting on the story about him having raped a child. I look into that one too. There's a lawsuit pending, and the players involved are at least as dubious as the ones promulgating Pizzagate. Still, the Trump story gets picked up by the likes of the New York Daily News, Politico, BuzzFeed, New York Magazine, The Independent, The Atlantic. As cameras gather for a news conference to hear the sordid tale from the supposed rape victim, she evaporates. There are more concocted stories that Trump's New York City modeling agency was caught trafficking young girls and hiding them in basements, that Trump is a secret plant who entered the presidential campaign as a pettifogger, surreptitiously working to get Clinton elected, that he's a stooge of Russian President Vladimir Putin in a Manchurian candidate scenario, a reference to the 1962 film about an American soldier who was brainwashed into carrying out communist plots. Not a day goes by without the voting public getting pummeled by countless narratives, some based on grains of truth, others wholly invented for the audience. Racist, Wall Street lackey, crooked liar, cheat, white nationalist, socialist, womanizer, misogynist, corrupt, xenophobic, homophobic, Islamophobic, anti-immigrant, basket of deplorables, fraudster, loser, alt-right, delusional, dangerous, mentally ill, pay-for-player, tax cheat. Assisted by ideologues, shady political operatives, and dark internet outfits seeking money-making clicks, Campaign 2016 shatters all records in the smear department. In this environment, the ability to execute a character assassination becomes more pivotal than any single campaign strategy. Operatives spring into action, exploiting the latest technology and tactics. Once relegated to grocery store tabloids, smears now figure prominently in most every mainstream news publication. Reporters pursue sordid narratives with the fervor of Jimmy Olsen chasing an exclusive for the Daily Planet. Smears become embedded in the fabric of our everyday existence, so common we barely flinch at the most audacious claims. With distrust of the news media at an all-time high, a skeptical public looks to alternative information sources and becomes easier to bamboozle. It's in this space, devoid of principles, where smears and fake news thrive. It's no longer a stretch for news consumers to believe that the press is covering up important stories or is in the tank for corporate and political interests. We didn't get here overnight. The past 2 decades have served as an ideal incubator for an industry of smears and fake news. The tools and tactics have evolved from old school to high tech. Incredible amounts of money changes hands, yet some of the most damaging smears can be accomplished with little more than an idea and an internet connection. By 2016, a Pew Research Center report found that more than 44% of the American adult population got its news on Facebook, which had 1.09 billion active daily users. Some of that news is true, some of it's not. Today, an entire movement can be started with a few bogus Twitter accounts and 140 characters or less. You don't have to spend millions on political ad buys anymore. observes one operative in the business. You can spark wildfires with just a tiny little stick now, which is a new thing. What exactly is a smear? It depends on who you ask. One man's smear is another man's truth. In simple terms, it's an effort to manipulate opinion by promulgating an overblown, scandalous, and damaging narrative. The goal is often to destroy ideas by ruining the people who are most effective at communicating them. What you may not know is that a lot of this manipulation is done through methods that are utterly invisible to the average consumer. Paid forces devise clever, covert ways to shape the total information landscape in ways you can't imagine. Their goal is to fool you. Public ideas are meticulously orchestrated to appear random. Op-eds printed in major news publications are ghostwritten by paid agents in the name of shills who rent the use of their signatures. Private eyes dig up dirt on enemies by dumpster diving for embarrassing information and compromising material. I'm going to skip ahead to, I thought you all, there's a lot written in the book about things other than the media and journalism industry, but I thought some of these excerpts about what we know about news industry collusion and behavior would be most interesting. So skipping ahead to a chapter I call Transactional Journalism, the Black Market Information Trade. Thanks to the persistent nature of email, we have documentary evidence of this ugly reality. Emails that expose the black market information trade, the transactional nature of relationships between newsmakers and the media. Every day, deals are being cut in secret, backs are scratched, one hand washes another. It makes it easy for special interests to advance an agenda or accomplish a smear. The past 9 years, there's been a breakneck acceleration in this disturbing trend. There have always been questionable dealings between some reporters and the interests they cover, both Democrat and Republican. But Barack Obama's presidency comes at a time where key factors conducive to transactional journalism coverage converge in an explosive way. Obama is the first Democrat elected to the nation's highest office since the invention of Facebook and Twitter, the first since the internet became firmly established as a means for journalists and their interests to frequently communicate in real time, and the first since the explosion in what I call quasi-news outlets online, which are often used to plant and feed narratives. Many left-leaning reporters who predominated major news outlets weren't interested in advancing the agenda of Obama's predecessor, George W. Bush, but they eagerly established dubious relationships with Obama agencies and officials, including then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Proof of these relationships is contained within several collections of internal emails. Some of them were released under Freedom of Information Act requests and lawsuits. Others were published by WikiLeaks in 2016. They reveal an unseemly coziness among prominent journalists and government officials. Once upon a time, reporters caught engaging in such behavior could expect to be ostracized or even banished from the field of journalism. Today, these relationships draw little more than snickers and a silent sense of relief from colleagues. Relief because they're glad that their emails weren't exposed. The emails offer us a chance to become voyeurs, peering in on private dealings between reporters and propagandists, a form of commerce never meant to be seen by outside eyes. Emails dating back to Obama's first months in office unmasked transactional journalism conducted by Washington reporter Mark Ambinder from The Atlantic. He's also written for the New York Times, New Yorker, Washington Post, Vice, Hotline, ABC News, CBS News. This particular transaction takes place on July 15, 2009, as Secretary of State Clinton is set to make a speech. Under normal circumstances, Clinton aide Philippe Rines might have to work pretty hard to convince reporters to cover the speech at all. It's not of much interest to average folks. But in today's dynamic, an advanced copy of the Clinton speech will be heralded as a great get, and Ambinder wants it. The question is, what's he willing to do to get it? In an email exchange, Rines, Hillary Clinton's aide, says there are certain conditions that Ambinder must meet in order to get the text of the speech. Ambinder replies, okay. Rines then dictates his terms in a numbered list. Number 1, you in your own voice describe Hillary's words as muscular. Number 2, you note that a look at the audience seating plan shows that all the envoys, from Holbrooke to Mitchell to Ross, will be arrayed in front of her, which in your own clever way you can say is certainly not a coincidence and meant to convey something. And number 3, you don't say you were blackmailed. Ambinder responds, got it. It's a remarkable scenario. Rines is a Clinton aide who's paid by taxpayers yet functioning like a private PR agent. It's the same at many federal agencies. Their press departments use their public positions to forward the agendas of their political bosses, all on our dime. In this instance, Ambinder poses as a journalist but agrees to serve the interests of the politician, all to get his hands on a speech that serves the interests of the politician. Here's an excerpt from Ambinder's final article. When you think of President Obama's foreign policy, think of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. That's the message behind a muscular speech that Clinton is set to deliver today to the Council on Foreign Relations. The staging gives a clue to its purpose. Seated in front of Clinton, subordinate to Clinton, in the first row, will be three potentially rival power centers, envoys Richard Holbrooke and George Mitchell, and National Security Council Senior Director Dennis Ross. The article delivers everything Rines had demanded. Once these emails about it become public in February 2016, the Atlantic issued a statement that reads, "This is not typical and this goes against our standards." For his part, Ambinder insists the emails don't capture the totality of his communication and aren't indicative of his normal reporting techniques. He explains, the way Rines had described the Clinton speech, it was muscular. So I found the adjective appropriate. So muscular was my word. The decision to characterize the envoys was mine. No one fed me anything, period. It must be coincidence then that other reporters thought up the exact same unusual adjective when describing the Clinton speech. Washington fixture Mike Allen of Politico and formerly of the New York Times and Time also calls the speech muscular and notes the seating arrangement as Rines had instructed Ambinder to do. Likewise, the headline at New York Magazine uses the word muscular, and the article shows a cartoon of Clinton with bodybuilder arms. Happenstance? You decide. But when you notice the news media or pundits all seizing upon similar terminology, it's reasonable to suspect there's an orchestrated effort. There's more secret collusion between news reporters and federal officials, buried in emails between the CIA and Ken Delanian, an AP reporter who had previously covered the spy agency for the Los Angeles Times. These emails from 2012 reveal a surprisingly deferential and collaborative relationship, according to The Intercept, which obtained the emails in 2014. Delanian's interactions with the CIA include him explicitly promising positive news coverage and sometimes sending the press office entire story drafts for review prior to publication. This is a stark departure from normal ethical practices for journalists. I'm working on a story about congressional oversight of drone strikes that can present a good opportunity for you guys, Delanian writes to a CIA press official in April 2012, adding that the story will be reassuring to the public. Later, Delanian sends the CIA press office a draft of his story and invites them to weigh in. This is where we are headed, he writes, asking if they want to push back on any of this. Next, Delanian emails a softer version of his story, according to The Intercept, and asks, does this look better? The next month, he sends the CIA another story draft. Guys, I'm about to file this if anyone wants to weigh in, he writes. And in May 2012, again, he sends the CIA a story outline. This is what we are planning to report, and I want to make sure you wouldn't push back against any of it, he writes. Delanian later concedes to The Intercept that it was a mistake for him to send unpublished stories to the CIA. I shouldn't have done it, and I wouldn't do it now, he says. But it had no meaningful impact on the outcome of the stories. I probably should have been reading them the stuff instead of giving it to them. In September 2012, there's a fascinating email exchange between reporters and Clinton aide Rines shortly after the Benghazi, Libya terrorist attacks. CNN has just reported that it's found the diary of murdered U.S. Ambassador Christopher Stevens in the burned-out rubble of the compound where he'd come under attack. The diary chronicles Stevens' worries about lax State Department security. That contradicts the narrative that Clinton and other Obama officials are spinning. They claim there was no way they could have predicted that Stevens and other Americans were at risk. Rines attempts to discourage other journalists from reporting on the Stevens diary by launching a Kill the Messenger campaign. He fires off an extraordinary email blast to more than 100 reporters, accusing CNN of violating the privacy of Stevens' family by reporting on the diary contents. There's record of only one reporter in the whole bunch pushing back, the late Michael Hastings of Rolling Stone and BuzzFeed, who died 9 months later in a fiery single-car crash. In an email to Rines, Hastings defends CNN's reporting and asks why it was the cable news network rather than the State Department that recovered Stephen's diary. Hastings implied that if U.S. officials were sloppy enough to overlook the diary, they might have also left behind other sensitive, valuable intelligence. Your statement about CNN sounded pretty defensive, Hastings writes to Rines. Do you think it's the media's responsibility to help secure State Department assets overseas after they've been attacked? Rines replies, as far as the tone of my email about CNN, I think you're misreading mine as much as I'm misreading yours as being needlessly antagonistic. No, you read my email correctly. I found your statement to CNN offensive, Hastings counters. Hastings is an exception. Other emails to and from Rines indicate it was far more common for reporters to shower him with adulation and flattery. In May 2010, Rebecca Cooper, the host then of a local Washington Business News TV program, emails Rines, I heart you. In June 2010, Jeremy Peters of the New York Times is looking for dirt about Politico. So this is New York Times looking for dirt about Politico, and seems delighted when Rines comes up with a quote for him. Politico thinks if a light bulb is out, that's a story. That's brilliant, Peters raves. You should totally let me use that on the record. That's great. Anything else you can recall like that, their greatest hits of non-news, would be great. The Washington Post also turns to Rines for ideas on how to smear Politico. The Post and Kornblatt emails to Rines, if you get bored in a meeting, want to send me some examples of Politico's most flagrant stupidity or errors? Why the jihad against Politico, by the way, is unclear. And under the heading of you wouldn't believe it if you didn't read it for yourself, other reporters send emails practically begging Rines to feed them propaganda. Massimo Calabresi, a Washington correspondent for Time, turns to Rines for help in producing a fawning 40 under 40 mini profile of Clinton confidant Jake Sullivan. What makes him successful in general? Sullivan at the time was widely considered a potential pick for a top Clinton post if she made it to the White House in 2016. Associated Press reporter Beth Fooey implores Rines for story assistance. I've been asked to do the Uma Abedin story. I really need your help, she pleads. CBS News submits a personal note telling Rines the network's about to launch a series on people who have achieved extraordinary success and made a significant contribution to society. The CBS reporter wants to include Hillary Clinton, of course. Maybe you thought the mission of reporters was to seek out original stories of interest to viewers, not smear one another and spread propaganda for favored interests. You thought State Department aides like Rines, paid with your tax dollars, would be spending their time serving the public. Instead, the media is being used as a private news agency creating a product intended for an audience of press and government insiders. So I will leave it there so we have time for questions and answers. Anybody?
If you guys have questions, we have microphones. I'm over here.
Okay.
We have microphones on either side of the room. You can just go up to them and ask your question. And we ask that you guys please alternate between the microphones.
I would like to ask Cheryl, if I may, where do you recommend that the average American can actually find news that doesn't seem to be so managed? And then a second question, if I may, could you shed some light on how news is packaged before it's released? For example, when the Access Hollywood expose on Trump came out, directly afterwards, there was a series of what was portrayed as spontaneous other eruptions of ladies who had also been supposedly or had accusations. But their videos seem to be so well produced to me in regard to the lighting and just the staging of it. And whereas there were about, 9 or 15 different ladies that came out after Access Hollywood, the whole perception that I had was it all seemed to be synoptically managed or packaged because it was all done so professionally and the timing seemed to be so coincidental. And possibly the same thing is happening in Alabama. I just wondered if you could shed some light on how these things so coincidentally happen.
Thank you. The book discusses how there's billion-dollar industries that make sure things happen on both sides and for corporations as well that organize this sort of thing. Doesn't mean they're false, but I do always give pause when I see these organized or highly organized seeming efforts. And even when they're not seemingly highly organized, if you listen to the smear artists quoted in my book, one of them said, every image you see that crosses your daily life, whether it's on the news, social media, or just things you hear put out by charities and comedy talk shows, whatever it may be, he says, are put there for a reason, often by highly paid interests that pay a lot of money to put them there. And if you start thinking of things in that context, you might become like me. I don't disbelieve everything I see initially, but I don't believe it initially until I know more. I'm smart enough to know that I need to do my own verification in this environment, even with the most obvious stories that everybody seems to agree on. So many times I do a little bit of investigating, looking at original sourcing, and find out something completely different. So I think you're right to listen to your instincts, to at least ask questions. And as to who to rely on for sort of a straight shot at the news, I think that's very difficult. I think there are great reporters at every news organization who are finding it more and more difficult to get their stories on unencumbered through the editorial process. So just based on your own experience, this is not a great answer, but I think you have to find reporters you trust on certain stories at different publications and rely on them, and don't take things at face value without knowing more yourself. Thank you.
My question is for Ken. As somebody who believes that in order to understand somebody, you have to, like they say, step in their shoes and listen to them, and as somebody who believes that the free market of ideas is the best way for you to be solid on your belief, and being somebody that is an ex-Republican, now having switched to the other side and being circled and in contact with people that have ACLU members, something that I never would have thought myself would become, I'm realizing that on both sides there's these extreme points of views, and nobody wants to hear something different. So for me, the step that you took would be the ideal thing, to expose yourself to the other side, be open-minded and listen. And my question to you would be, as you went through this experience, have you found that some of your beliefs before have shifted more towards the other direction, only because you now have listened to the argument and come to the conclusion, well, I used to think this way, this is now a valid point, now I'm shifting a little bit more towards where I didn't used to be before?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I started off as a Democrat. I switched my party registration to Republican for the year. I was going to whole hog, go in for it, and I didn't know what would happen when I finished. I know enough about sort of social science and motivated reasoning to believe, that I might see things from the other side and learn a bit, and I did. But what I found out, and I sort of changed my views on some issues, and that's part of the narrative of the book. But I found out sort of two things. I sort of took away two things in the end. One of which is, despite all the narrative around polarization, what hasn't changed is actually issue polarization. Attitude polarization has changed. We hate the other side. But actually, American views on the issues haven't changed very much over the last 25 years. We remain a surprisingly moderate people. And even people you talk to think of themselves as down the pike, liberal, down pike, conservative, actually turn out to be much more nuanced in real life. So I came away much more skeptical of the overarching story that there's one side or the other and there's no in between. Because in fact, when you sit down with people, you often find there's easy to find common ground. One of the stories I tell in the book is a guy named Sam Adams, not the Patriot brewer, but the mayor of Portland, Oregon, the first openly gay mayor of a major U.S. American city. And the biggest partnership he forged during his tenure as mayor of Portland was with the evangelical community. And what he told me and what he's consistently said over the years is, look, I'm not going to agree with him on abortion. I'm certainly not going to agree with him on gay rights. But in 8 out of 10 things that matter to the community, we're going to agree on each other. Why are we talking about those two when we should be talking about how to succeed on the 8? And that's really sort of where I came out. I'm now a registered independent, and I'm comfortable trying to take ideas from both sides.
There's someone up there. No.
Okay. Hi, this is for Cheryl. Do you think that there is a real proliferation of this behind-the-scene narrative in media, or maybe I think it's just we're coming out of the closet with it because it's always been there, but now it's easier to expose and see behind the scenes what is going on in these exchanges between reporters and people in influential places. It's always happened. We just have a window now to see it, and it's part of the culture of America to exchange services for something. We start doing it with our kids. They're always negotiating with their parents about everything now. So why should it be different in news?
I agree with your observations. There's a little bit about history of that sort of thing in the book. I think it's always been around, like you say, and everybody tries to do it. Everybody wants to influence the media, of course. But I do think at the same time there's an explosion in the organized industry that has figured out how to use modern tactics to accomplish their goal, and as I say, peek their nose under the tent of news organizations, influence the narratives that they discuss on a daily basis. It's a very sophisticated and learned way that they've gone about this over the past probably 2 decades to develop and hone the jobs that they do, and that's discussed in the book. Thank you.
Hi, my question is for Ken Stern. I have a number of relatives and grammar school friends who are conservatives. None of them embody the economic anxiety and bad luck that you've explained. All of them embody assorted flavors of bigotry. So are you sure you didn't mishear that quote, that what they were really telling you was the awfulness of America, not awesomeness?
Funny. Look, there are 125 million people who voted in the last election. It's 125 million stories. And I can only tell you 2 things, my experiences and what the data shows. And I met tons of people. I mean, I met lots of people who voted for Obama and voted for Trump. And to me, that was a little bit of the story of this election, is that attitudinal change among people. And I think if you look at the data, there's always been racial prejudice. There probably always will be racial prejudice that drives some of the voting behaviors, but those voting behaviors really haven't changed. This year is no different if you look at sort of the crosstabs in the electoral history and people's answers to why they voted. That really hasn't changed very much over the years. What has changed, I think, is, and what drove this victory is the sense of, look, Trump got 62 million votes. Some of that was white working class, some of it wasn't. But the shift, he won the white working class by 39%. And that's where he won Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And that was he only needed 78, he only won those by 78,000 votes. And that was really the shift that has occurred. And I think that is a question. Look, it doesn't take going around the country to actually know if, when you find a community of people, whatever color they are, who are on a 30-year economic decline, whose sense of optimism, it's actually a lot of polling on sense of optimism about the future, largely gone. That's going to be a very angry, unhappy people, and they're going to cast ballots in that way. And if we don't understand, the Democrats after the election said, we got to get back in touch with these voters that historically are voters. As far as I can tell, they really haven't done anything to change that. So, you have your narrative, I don't dispute it. I have mine, but I think the story of the election, if you want to look at it, really is the anger from different parts of the country and how that played out in terms of voting patterns.
So in the spirit of your book, then, we can agree to disagree. Thank you.
Hey, this question's for Cheryl. So I work in campaigns and politics, and I completely agree with your thesis. I think so many times I've seen it where there's this need for narrative, that facts get kind of forgotten. I've had on several occasions people try to explain to me things about legislation that I was involved in passing that I have no idea where they get it from. It's happened so many times where people have told me stories about either campaigns or legislation where I was like literally there, and I'm just like, where'd you get this like fanatical story from? Like, none of that ever happened. And then they'll point to really reputable sources. So my question is, a lot of the topics that I see covered in media today, I get the majority of my news from Twitter and people I know in real life. I don't really have news outlets on a day-to-day basis. But a lot of these stories are really complex issues that honestly, maybe only like 100 people in the State Department truly have the capability to understand. So do you think part of this problem comes from like a public's kind of pseudo-intellectual pursuit to want to grapple with topics that they don't necessarily have the time for or really the education for? They're very, very, very well-educated people who, the one thing I've learned in politics is how little I know. In my 8-year career is how little I know about public policy. Every single day I realize like how less and less I know. And do you think that that plays into all of this? That publics like need to be like, well, I'm a foremost expert on Iran, but I spend 60 hours a week selling insurance. But I know everything about Iran. Let me talk about Iran like an expert, and let me read this New York Times article that will make me feel that way.
It's that syndrome of we feel like we're an expert because we did a little research or read an article or two, and then we pontificate as if we know. I do think there's some of that, but I also would argue the subjects that are making it to the plate in our news diet are so orchestrated in many cases. I mean, I came from a University of Florida school where if a story was handed to you, if someone presented you with a press release, you were not to cover that as a news story. That was a beginning point. That's what somebody wanted you to believe. So your job was, if it seemed newsworthy, to find out the truth. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, maybe it's part truth. Today, I feel as though these industries that I talk about have figured out how to place on the plate at news organizations through ways that news organizations don't even always see themselves, topics they want covered in a certain way, framed in a way that you may hear come back to you that don't even seem to ring true, but somebody's framing that way because it's to their benefit or they want it to be understood that way. That's the end of it that I see, so that's about all I can speak to from that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question for Ken.
Yes.
I'm a lifelong Teddy Roosevelt Republican. There aren't very many around anymore.
Yep.
I started voting in '56. I voted for Eisenhower, and except for Kennedy, I voted Republicans all the way through the first Bush's first election. And I'm still annoyed at myself for taking so long to realize what had happened. Can you explain to me what conservatives have done to make this a better country in terms of voting rights, civil rights, clean air, clean water, labor, strong labor conditions to provide, all the things everybody's complaining about? What have conservatives actually done to make this a better country?
So I think you're asking the wrong guy. Because my book's really not a defense of one part or the other. The sort of the notion of, and I'm sure there's another speaker here that is probably best to address it. Look, my book is How I Learned to Love the Right, is a play on the Lincoln speech in the Civil War when he talked about the bonds of affection that has to unite the North and the South. And the notion that his notion, which I think is applicable today, that if, in his case, if you could see past the horrible slaughter of the Civil War and see the notion of one community, one country, one people, we need to do that today. Because I think he saw, and I think there's a challenge today, which is the anger from one side or the other was going to kill the nation. It kind of did for 50 years. And I think we're at that same, we're not there, but we're heading down the same place. And the question I had before, the implication, I think, was that the 62 million people on the other side were somehow, who voted for Trump were somehow illegitimate. They did it out of anger or bigotry or hatred or racism. And I think that's the kind of place we're at. And because I think if someone on the conservative sitting here sort of asks the question on the other side about liberals, and that's a very dangerous place. And part of the story here is it's not who I met. I mean, I met a lot of people who voted for Trump or considered themselves conservatives because they cared about sort of the sort of loss of social values in the country, the growth of single-parent families, the loss of liberty to government. This is not my story; it's theirs. And the over-entanglement in government. I think there's a lot of stories about why people choose. And I think if we're going to be one country and one people, we need to honor those stories and listen to them and not sort of reject them out of hand. I'm not saying you did, but I think that's really the sort of the nature of this, which is we have a lot to learn from each other. And, I think if you want to answer your question, I think if you want to draw down sort of the Republican leadership of over the years, putting aside our current government, I think there's plenty of people who will stand up and honor it's not my story, but honor the presidency of Ronald Reagan or Dwight Eisenhower or others who I think sort of drove the country in places they think were important at the time.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.